I don't know whether I am an outsider within or an insider without. But I do know that I've always been a misfit. I have been a misfit my entire life and ministry as an educator, pastor, ecumenist, and theologian. I want to focus my remarks on this panel on what a common experience this is for groups of persons who miss the mark because they're not white, Euro-American, affluent, heterosexual, able-bodied, or male. Then I will turn to the ways the feminist movement has helped to make sense of this problem of being a misfit. They have exposed the contradictions between what we have been taught about liberty and justice for all and the way exclusion works in groups and institutions, large and small, as we have just heard. As an educated, white, Euro-American Protestant woman, I have access to privileges of the oppressor group in our society and in its norms. But I am always status inconsistent. A woman who has authority in the church as a pastor and theologian, but also a lesbian feminist who advocates for the full humanity of all women together with all men in harmony with the creation. I came by my misfitness at an early age. In kindergarten, I ran away from Sunday school. And I crossed all the forbidden streets to go home to tell my mother that there was nothing there of interest to a girl like me. By 7th grade, I was already 5'8", and I was the tallest girl in the class, a tomboy who did not fit. When I followed my mother's footsteps and went to Wellesley College, I thought I would really fit. After all, we were all girls. But I had not counted on the fact that I lived in a co-op dorm where all the daughters of ministers and missionaries and less affluent families were collected. I compounded this difference by electing to major in religion, a universally disliked subject because it was required in our sophomore year. One day, I was on the train with my father going to New York. He was a businessman, worked there. And I told him that I was going to work in the church as a Christian educator. He looked at me and he said, "You'll be sorry, because you'll always be a misfit." And I was more than he thought. Most of the time, I felt like an insider without. But in 1951, I went to work in the East Harlem Protestant Parish in New York City and found myself as an outsider within. There I was accepted even though I did not fit in a poor Puerto Rican and black ghetto. I wasn't so lucky with Harvard and the Presbyterian Church. After 3 years in East Harlem, I applied to Harvard Divinity School, although they did not accept women, saying that it was time that they did. To my surprise, they accepted me, and I went there with Connie Parvey and became one of the first 2 women to graduate from Harvard Divinity School. The United Presbyterian Church in the United States was not much better. It didn't ordain women, and it had no jobs for women pastors. However, many other women and men caught the spirit of reform by the time I had graduated, and I was able to become the first woman ordained in my presbytery and to return to East Harlem as a pastor. There I was lucky. In spite of my connections to power through whiteness, education, and now ordination, I continued to be accepted there as Letty. After 17 years in East Harlem, I finished my THD at Union Theological Seminary, married Hans Huckendijk, and went to teach at the Christian Brothers Manhattan College in the Bronx, which was an all-male school. When I was interviewed at what was then this men's college, the brother who was the president was disappointed because I was not African American and only represented 2 outsider slots, woman and Protestant. He said to me, "Who are you anyway?" And I answered him, "I am a father, brother." They must have been really hard up because I got the job. For me, there is no separation between religion and the feminist movement. Those of us who struggle for empowerment in church institutions are simply part of the larger and very diverse movement for inclusion and empowerment of women in all fields and in all parts of the world. I say that because the movement has helped to make sense of what is a very common experience for many outsiders and oppressed groups, because it names the contradictions in our lives so that we can see them and work with others to change them, something you've heard from every person on this panel and all weekend. It helps us with this common experience of not fitting, and we find out why and pay the price to make a change. Feminism came into my life while I was in East Harlem, engaged in the struggles of the civil rights movement, as Rosemary mentioned. When I read Betty Friedan and Mary Daly in the late 60s, I knew right away that they were describing another structure of oppression, one that included me in the oppressed group, as well as part of the oppressor group. I began writing women's liberation material for the church and the YWCA in the early 70s, and joined others, such as Claire Randall and Lois Wilson, in supporting the international women's networks through the World Council of Churches. The book that helped me make sense of my experience in justice work and my experience as a woman was Human Liberation in a Feminist Perspective, a Theology, published in '74. It tried to show that liberation theology, Black theology, and feminist theology have the same liberating roots in the Christian tradition, and that, as they all say, no one is free until all are free. That book grew out of a network of resistance in the World Council of Churches. I was involved in a study called Christians in Changing Institutions for the World Council. I could not get them to include a feminist group in the study. So I created one in New York City and met with Jean Audrey Powers, Claire Randall, Joan Martin, and other church bureaucrats and pastors to decide how Christian women were changing institutions. I wrote a report. People in the World Council always need reports. So they published it under the title Human Liberation in a Feminine Perspective. You can't win everything. This began a network that continued to work for change in the World Council, which called itself WOW, Women of the World. and worked to mandate the election of women to all the committees of the World Council at the 1975 Nairobi Assembly. After this successful campaign, we changed our name to ARSAC, Ad Hoc Group on Racism, Sexism, and Classism. We liked big names. And we kept going ever since. 25 years later, we have added ageism to our title. Out of the feminist movement, I discovered that being a misfit is a gift and an opportunity for a revolution of small changes. It allows us to understand the meaning of hospitality and the honoring of difference from the side of the stranger. We know what it means not to fit. That should count for something when we begin to work on justice issues. When I speak of God's welcoming the stranger and our partnership in this welcoming action for all religions, races, and genders, I can do so, at least in part, as one who claims what post-colonial feminists call hybridity. I am both outside and within institutional power structures. As an advocate of peace and justice, I can work together with others for the empowerment of all peoples, regardless. This practice of God's hospitality means that I am constantly looking for ways to empower other outsiders in institutions where I live and work. I always have to ask myself as I gather with a group, who is missing? Something we've all been talking about all weekend here. Who is missing? Who are the ones whose voice is not heard? I learned this from the gospel message of Jesus Christ as a Christian. But I have also found that it makes sense of the rhetoric of the feminist movement. Who is missing? For instance, in 1988, I joined Katie Cannon, Ada Maria Izazi-Diaz, and Kwok Pilan to edit a book entitled Inheriting Our Mother's Gardens. In inviting women to tell stories of their mothers, we were encouraging women to find their own identity and self-worth and to honor their own way of thinking theologically. At the same time, this provided an opening for women writers of color to be published so that they would have an easier time trying to break into publishing and becoming outsiders within, as Ada told us about her 6 tries. I value being a misfit because it keeps me on edge, looking for the power quotient in any situation. In fact, I worried about going to teach at Yale in 1972 because my own racial and class background fit too well. But not to worry. A lesbian teaching feminist, queer, and liberation theologies is not quite up to the old norm. They never thought I was an old blue, even though I have a blue jacket on. There I was, a triangular peg in a square hole, or a round hole, whatever. The faculty always wondered how I managed to get in. And I always was determined to make the most of it. I learned in East Harlem, and ever since, that in God's sight, no one is a misfit. Thank God for the second women's movement and the opportunity to be making sense of women's lives. And in case you're worried that someday I will not be a misfit, but just old like many people on these panels. Don't ask us what to do 20 years from now. That's up to you. You should know that Yale has made me a misfit forever. They gave me a certificate of retirement that declared me to be an honorably retired boy. Unable to write Latin or to think that a woman might have been around long enough to retire, they wrote on my certificate, Emeritus Professor of Theology. When last heard from, they had not figured out how to change my title to Emerita. You know, sometimes it really is fun to be a misfit.